Hey guys, Pride here, and I figured it was time to jump back into another of my top 5 videos. So today, we're going to be breaking down underutilized and underappreciated units that deserve to see the battlefields of Total War Warhammer more often. Units that, through some combination of cost efficiency, versatility, and overall performance can be quite exceptional, but have nevertheless kind of flown under the radar and aren't as hyped or outwardly impactful in comparison to the MVPs of each faction's roster. They might not be the strongest or outright best units in a given situation, but when used wisely, can dictate the pace of engagement and outright win you battles. Ignore them at your peril. And as always, this list should still be useful for campaign players, but as tech, skill trees, building chains, and lord bonuses add too many confounding variables to fully account for, this list will be focused a bit more on the custom battle and multiplayer side of things. So, let's toss a little salt and pepper on the Barbie and get it nice and spicy for the top 5 underrated units players should use more often in Total War Warhammer 2. Let's get into it, shall we? And coming in at number 5, we have Cyrenes, the buxom beauties of the Vampire Coast. Now, the Undead Pirates are a faction of extremes, a race with some of the very best unit choices in the game, and some of the very worst. Their most expensive units top out at a whopping 2,000 Warhammer bucks, while their zombies are some of the cheapest and most cost-efficient frontliners in the New World. And in the scramble to gobble up more of those fantastic handguns, cheap meat shields, or powerful monsters for your builds, it can be kind of easy to overlook an ethereal unit sitting smack dab in the middle of their roster in terms of price. Now, ethereal units don't exactly have the greatest track record in Mortal Empires. There was a short time where Cairn Wraith and Crypt Horror Death Stars for the vampire counts were all the rage, but those days have faded long into memory, and despite not being a terrible unit, Cairn Wraiths have faded alongside. But Cyrenes have a couple advantages over their ghastly brothers, and a lot of special traits that make them surprisingly effective when used in the right situation. Like all ethereals, they have 75% physical resistance and a small HP pool of only 3,700 HP on large, with a stat line that, at least on paper, looks pretty mediocre for 850 gold. This shouldn't really come as a surprise. All ghost units have relatively subpar melee stats. It's a trade-off for their perceived tankiness and ability to avoid damage from non-magical sources. Of course, it doesn't always work this way in reality, but that's the idea. What is surprising, though, is their melee defense, which at 32 is 60% higher than the melee defense for Cairn Wraiths. When you combine that high melee defense with their Charmed Contact effect, a seducing stare that lowers enemy melee attack by 9, you get a unit that can actually be incredibly resilient in the face of melee rushes. Melee defense is arguably the most important stat line for infantry because it's the main value that determines how long a unit can actually hold in the face of adversity. It's a determining factor in how often they get hit and how often they take damage. And so when you're talking about the Vampire Coast, a faction that needs its infantry to hold as long as possible so their formidable gunpowder play can be brought to bear, Cyrenes can be an incredible stopgap unit that doesn't just hold up well themselves, but also makes your entire army tankier by lowering the hit chance of your opponents. Their effective HP pool is gigantic when paired with Invocation of the Heck. They synergize incredibly well with heals, and enemy factions trying to counter the Vampire Coast will typically load up on cheap fodder in an attempt to swarm the front line, tying down zombies and creating space for the fast movers to get into the artillery and handguns in the back. And once those are shot down, it's usually game set match for the coast. Fodder like Bleak Swords, Skinks, and Empire Swordsmen are very common picks against them. And Cyrenes are a direct counter to units like this, because they're a source of cheap terror. 75% of their weapon damage is armor piercing, and at 48 speed, they have the mobility to run down routing troops, flank, and slaughter skirmishers as well. They are not and never will be a frontline unit, except in dire circumstances, but their ability to improve the survival rate of nearby allies, their synergy with the rest of the roster, and their surprising tankiness combine to make for a very potent unit that can see play against Chaos, Dark Elves, Lizardmen, Greenskins, Beastmen, and really any faction that is susceptible to terror. And saddling up at number 4 are the Grail Guardians of Bretonnia. If If you've ever played a Fey Enchantress campaign, there's a fair chance you understand just how powerful the Sword and Board elite of Bretonnia can be, and a full stack of them can make even the endgame errantry quests a complete joke. But Grail Guardians are a unit that sees a lot less play in multiplayer, and a big reason for that are Grail Knights, the Lance variant. At this point, I think we all know just how strong the purveyors of Prima Nocta truly are. I covered them in depth in my best units for every faction video, and even a full year later, I think they remain the single most important unit in the Bretonnian roster. And it's because Grail Knights are so good that I think Grail Guardians are often overlooked and completely skipped, even though they fill a very different role and can be absolutely devastating when used effectively. So the obvious point to make about these Living Saints is that their stat line is bananas. They have the highest melee defense of any cav unit in the game at 56, and pair that with 120 armor and 5,700 health, 30 and 700 more respectively than their Grail Knight counterparts. On average, their health pool is about 600 more than elite knights from other factions. They have the second highest HP pool of cav units in the game. So when you combine that large HP pool with their 20% physical resistance from the Blessing of the Lady, it's no surprise these are the tankiest heavy knights in Mortal Empires, the only dedicated anchor unit in a roster that is otherwise pretty flimsy in the leadership department and quite squishy to boot. The synergy they have with Favor of the Fae's plus 44 melee attack and healing from the Lore of Life should be immediately apparent, and it's why the Fae uses them as her goons. But I think immunity to Vigor is really what sets this unit apart. Fatigue, or Vigor as it's known in Warhammer, plays a massive but for some reason hidden role in Warhammer 2. Units that are at the max level of exhaustion lose 30% of their melee defense, 35% of their armor value, and debuffs to their reload rate, speed, attack, and charge bonus as well. Pretty brutal combat debuffs, so always fighting as a fresh unit is a very important trait to have, and one of the reasons Bretonnian cavalry is so strong. But Grail Guardians benefit from this immunity to fatigue substantially more than Grail Knights do, because Grail Knights are meant to cycle charge. They are meant to rout units off the impact of a single decisive strike, and thus rely on their charge bonus to deal the majority of their damage. They don't want to stay in melee for any lengthy period of time. Grail Guardians, on the other hand, are a unit meant to get stuck in and stay there, holding the line while the shock cavalry maneuvers around for a decisive hammer and anvil. So in the front ranks, in the meat grinder, avoiding fatigue debuffs makes them a powerhouse unit, one that is always fighting at peak efficiency. Their low charge bonus and slightly slower movement speed is counteracted by use of Lance Formation, which gets their charge from 38 to upwards of 50. They take much less attrition damage than Grail Knights do when cycle charging because of their high armor and high melee defense, and they even have 5 more leadership. They are not a unit you'll typically want to go full Rohirrim with, as they are very expensive at 1600 gold, but 1 or 2 anchoring the center of your formation can do wonders for the staying power of your battle line. I think the main reason the Lancer variant gets picked over them so often is because of their bonus versus large, which helps them win cav fights and fulfill a more classic role out on the flanks, but make no mistake, Grail Guardians have a vicious streak a mile wide. They are killers, and they fill a role that no other unit does on the Bretonnian roster, a unit that can actually hold the line and kill stuff where the poopy peasants would run and flee. Fear not, the Knights of Bretonnia will be your shield. Now give me your goddamn crops. And skittering in at number 3 are the 8-legged freaks of the Badlands, Forest Goblin Spider Riders for the Greenskins. Put your arachnophobia aside for a second, I'm right there with ya. Had a wolf spider the size of my fist in my bathroom a couple days ago, but these unassuming and freaky little critters are low-key some of the most cost-efficient killers in Warhammer 2. Top tier and competitive players know all about their goodness, but it is high time the rest of the community who haven't given them a second glance do so now. But to understand why Forest Goblin Spider Riders are so strong, we first have to understand poison. Every time an arachnid bites, every time a single model lands an attack, it pumps poison into the entire enemy formation, slowing them down, reducing their effectiveness in melee, and corroding their ability to strike back. Cuts their speed by 24%, cuts their weapon damage, AP, and missile damage by 20%, and it is one of the strongest debuffs in the series because it is constant, unlike the finite and cooldown dependent resource that is Winds of Magic. As long as you are in melee, the enemy will be poisoned. So Spider Riders already have a pretty great stat line at their price point of 400 gold. 30 melee defense is 8 more than Dark Riders, already considered one of the strongest light cav units in the game, and they have Strider, so they fight and move at peak efficiency in Forest as well, which is a pretty big deal considering how often they start the battle vanguarded on the opponent's side of the battlefield. But when you combine their impressive stat line, cheap price, and great mobility with poison, a debuff that typically comes at a premium on light cav units, like the 3 times more expensive Doomfire Warlocks at 1200 gold, you've got a unit that can be ignored only at your own peril. At 400 gold, they are super cheap, and they actually pack a wallop. Whether they're being used for running down archers, rear-charging knights in a cav fight, or preventing high-value units from rallying, Forest Goblin Spider Riders are the complete package when it comes to traits you want in a light cav unit. They can equalize the cav fight by poisoning enemy knights, and in a meta that already favors wide builds and high mobility, perhaps it shouldn't be such a shock that such an unassuming, friendly little spoder packs the punch of a Black Widow. The Wa is green, and the Wa is mean. We as Gobos indeed. Now somebody go get the flamethrower. Ah, there it is. I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory. And on to the number 2 slot, we have Flame Drakes, the tunnel-fighting Ironbreakers of the Karazankor. If you've played a campaign with Dwarf Santa Claus recently, you'll know the power of melting hordes of Gobos and Orc Boys with Gromby and his starting Iron Drakes. They are a very powerful campaign unit, but can also be pretty good in multiplayer. But this is a unit that's been slept on and outright lambasted in worse unit videos before. And at the very least, as of the Empire Undivided update, that is thoroughly undeserved. Explosion damage was entirely reworked and buffed alongside the Hunter and the Beast patch, and it's turned their DPS into something that can no longer be ignored. So for a very modest price point of 700 gold, you get a unit with impressive leadership, 125 armor, and one of the quickest chaff clears in the setting. Now that in and of itself cannot be overlooked, because as a low mobility faction, dwarves can sometimes have trouble with getting swarmed by low cost fodder. Once all your infantry gets tied down, it becomes very difficult to protect your back line, and that's when the chariots and fast movers can play havoc on your ranged units and artillery. Flame Drakes can almost single-handedly eliminate this problem. They hard counter light infantry, quickly deleting chaff and freeing up your dwarf warriors and longbeards to go do something else. Their flame imbues a -8 leadership penalty on contact, which combined with their ability to rapidly deplete health bars, means that enemy units often run after only 1 or 2 volleys from them. And oh yeah, they also ignore shields. Their missile attack is treated like artillery, so they will melt right through that silver shield like it doesn't even exist. And as of the Empire Undivided patch, the dwarfs now have an incredibly powerful option for neutralizing the cav, chariots, and flyers that typically threaten them. Rune of Wrath and Ruin, baby. The new version with 72% reduction to speed and charge momentum gives your other range units the time they need to focus down the threat while your Iron Drakes reposition and toast more infantry. But possibly the most exciting thing about this unit is that their damage output against armored targets is actually very good, which in terms of conventional wisdom and their role on the tabletop makes perfect sense. They were armor piercing in the Dwarf's 8th edition army book, and one would fully expect napalm burning with the fury of 1,000 suns to boil a dude in armor alive. But since Warhammer 1, people have been complaining that their DPS against armored targets was pretty trash. Not anymore. I'll be honest, I don't know how much should be attributed to the newest patch and the changes to explosive damage, and how much came from previous buffs over the life cycle of Mortal Empires, but Iron Drakes deal more than 2,000 damage to shielded Chaos Warrior units from the front in only a single volley each, and will often cause them to waver on the second volley. This is when firing into units with 100 armor plus. There are very few ranged units in Mortal Empires even remotely near the price of Iron Drakes that have that kind of damage potential. So I'd say the commonly told legend that Flame Drakes are bad versus armor is just that, a myth. Not to mention they deal flaming damage, which absolutely butchers regen monsters infantry like trolls and cryptors. And again, with a unit like this, you don't really expect to be able to deal well with large targets, but trolls and cryptors will melt in the face of all that flame. One thing to note though, if you do want to get maximum efficiency out of Iron Drakes, do not spread them as wide as they will go. They are a unit that will constantly have to reposition, and when you spread them really wide, it takes a significantly longer time for them to reacquire a target and begin firing again. Keep them 3 or 4 ranks deep, and they will do a lot more killing and a lot less repositioning and doing that Tosa shuffle we learned about in Shogun 2. It's not good to see your range units constantly reshuffling when they should be firing. An anti-swarm unit in a faction that is susceptible to being swarmed, they have found new life with the changes to Wrath and Ruin and explosive damage, and can be useful in a variety of different matchups and are amazing for clearing out chaff, which is a pretty big threat to the dwarf roster. Do not sleep on Flame Drakes anymore. Don't shoot, just let them burn. So before we get to number 1 on our list, I want to give a quick shout out and honorable mention to the unit that inspired this entire video really. The infamous Marauder Horsemen with Javelins. They've been a thorn in our side since Warhammer 1, essentially, spammed incessantly by the Varg and Scaling tribes before Norska's official release as DLC, and are overall one of the most annoying units to deal with in Total War Warhammer. Whether you're playing campaign or multiplayer, it doesn't really matter. They didn't make the top 5 because I think at this point most people are aware of just how versatile they are. I know I've definitely hyped them up and discussed them at length in the past, and the reason is that light mobile units are at a premium in Warhammer 2's meta, because of the way routing works. If a unit terror routes, chasing them down isn't such a big deal, because they automatically rally after a short delay, and when they do, oftentimes it's a unit you really don't want your light cav fighting. But a true leadership route based purely on morale will not allow a unit to rally when it's being run down by fast movers. So you can have the strongest, most powerful single entity monster or infantry regiment in the game, and it will not come back to the fight if they're being chased off the map by the cheapest and crappiest. That is until you prevent the dogs of war from nipping at their heels. And so Marauder Jav Cav combines that 90 speed and chasing potential with the damaging missiles and the option to slowly, steadily plunk away the HP of all your opponent's highest value units. Whether that be Cav, monsters, lords, you name it, Marauder Cav will be there to harass them and piss them off for eternity, for the majority of the game. And more than anything, they provide a ton of battlefield control, exerting their influence anywhere they are needed. At 500 gold, super cost-efficient unit, and that's why they're so prevalent in competitive gameplay. And that leaves the big kahuna, the number 1 most underrated unit players should be using more often in Total War Warhammer 2, and that honor will go to the Harpies of the Beastmen and the Dark Elves. When I see an opponent using Harpies, I know right off the bat my opponent is dangerous and has a good grasp on the importance of fast movers. Harpies are fell bats that actually kill things. Death from above with the ability to deploy anywhere on the map they want. A complete nightmare for enemy artillery and skirmishers, and a surprising amount of utility in a small package in aerial duels and cav fights as well. Of particular note on their stat line, that 38 melee defense is quite impressive for a unit you'd think would be very, very squishy, and 44 weapon strength is actually brutal. The units you'll typically tie down with Harpies generally melt under their assault from the air. They're a very important tool in tightening the noose on dwarfs, in that they're actually a direct counter to gyrocopter play, and they represent a significant threat to the Wood Elves, High Elves, Empire, Lizardmen, Vampire Coast, Skaven, and Tomb King's back line, because they can so easily pick and choose their engagements and completely shut down ranged play from any angle. And as we discussed with Marauder Jav Cav a little bit ago, this is a relatively cheap unit with 80 plus speed that can run down big monsters, elite cavalry, and expensive lords entirely off the map the second they route, with the added benefit of being able to escape back into the air if things start getting dicey. They count as small models, so anti-large has no effect on them whatsoever, and one of the most important roles they play for both the Dark Elves and the Beastmen is as a riot shield for Cav. As a flying unit that can't be attacked by ground units until they're engaged in melee, they can completely neuter the charge bonus of enemy knights, allowing your Centaurs or Cold Ones to close the gap and get a full charge bonus off for free, allowing them to trade upwards and in many cases outright win against vastly superior opposition. As winning the mobility game is one of the most direct routes for victory in Total War, the impact of that weird little trick cannot be overstated. Enemy knights hate them, and because of that 44 weapon strength, if you rear charge enemy cav or infantry, you can actually get a surprising amount of kills with them as well. They do not benefit from racial traits like Primal Fury or Murderous Prowess, which would have solidified them even further at the number 1 slot, but for the amazing combination of speed, surprising resilience to melee damage, vanguard deployment, and tools for shutting down much more expensive units, I think Harpies are well deserving of the crown and are a unit that every single player should be using more often because they are very, very underrated. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed my list of the top 5 most underrated units. Let me know in the comment section below which units you would include in your own lists, and I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.